Workers' Day 2024. Welcome everybody. My name is Jody Hendricks and I'll be facilitating this conversation about this book called Colored, How Classification Became Culture. And I'm joined by the two authors, Tessa. She's a political analyst. Morning.
Morning. I should use the mic. Morning.
And then also Lynsey, Ebony, Chutel. And she's a multimedia journalist. Also, welcome to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with, this book is for colored people, by colored people, a book of colored and colorful stories from varied corners of South Africa, vista, past, present, and future. Why did you want to write this book? Let's start with you, closest to me, Tessa.
So we didn't want to write the book. It's a very important part of the story. I don't think either Lynsey and I ever thought we would write a book about colored identity, maybe not even a book at all, at least for me. But the book was thrust upon us in an important moment in our country's history.
What was that moment, if I may ask?
Yeah, so in 2020, a young man named Nathaniel Julies was murdered by the police in Eldorado Park. And it was at the same time that George Floyd's murder in the US had started kind of a tipping point around the Black Lives Matter movement. So it was kind of a similar thing that was happening at the time. And so both Lynsey and I, in various contexts, were asked to reflect on this. Her as a journalist, me as somebody who's giving social and political commentary. And I think it became a really difficult set of conversations for me, particularly in the public domain. Firstly, I think what struck me was that very few people, even though I'd been commenting in the public space for a while, hadn't considered that I was colored until that moment. I'd never been asked about colored identity until that moment. And I think it had missed people that I was colored, which struck me. Number two, it was about the community that I was raised in, Eldorado Park. And so it was very personal in that sense. But there were two questions that were asked to me during that time that struck me. One was, why are colored people angry? And the other was, why are people still using the word colored? And the why people are still using the word colored, I understood to a certain extent because of the historical origins of the term colored, and this break with apartheid should mean a break with those terms. But the question also meant, what does colored mean now? When I say the word colored, what do I mean? And especially, what does the generation of people after me, my niece is here, Gabby in the audience, and what does it mean for Gabby when she says the word colored? Is she talking about that same construct? But the bigger question for me was the why are colored people angry? And there was almost in that an accusation embedded in it. Because I was like, because we live in South Africa, we are all angry, don't care. But there was almost like an accusation tone that said, you shouldn't be angry. You're not allowed to be angry. And I started realizing that came from a place where there was a sense that there wasn't a legitimacy either about just the identity or because of the privileges and those meager privileges of apartheid that came with coloredness, that there's a resentment towards the community. And I think for me, writing the book was in response to that, wanting to unpack that and give voice to it.
Lynsey, do you want to add something around the anger that's perpetuated by the media? I'm a journalist myself. I remember a couple of years ago when there was a protest in a colored community and the people were just sitting there, voicing the anger. And the photographer told him, no, stand up and shout and jump so that I can take a photo. Just so that and it seems to me like they want to perpetuate that colored people are angry. Do you want to respond to that? And also, did you want to write the book or not, like Tessa?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I'm a journalist, and I suppose, I've mainly worked for international media houses. And so there were two things happening. So if you're working in a South African newsroom, there's an understanding of what colored townships are supposed to be like, right? So I can't believe, first of all, that photographers should be fired. That's just unethical. You can't tell people to protest for your camera, right? That's just not done. The other thing is just that we take for granted that colored communities look the way they are just because, the Cape Flats are just because they are. That's it. And that's just the status quo. That's just the way it's supposed to be. And we do perpetuate that. And so what was the advantage, I suppose, about writing about it for an American audience is, so my day job is I work for the New York Times, and so I have an editor calling me from New York, and she's like, there's this hashtag, because it's, Black Lives Matter is tearing the United States apart, it's tearing the UK apart, France, even Belgium. And, she's like, there's this hashtag, and she can't say it. She's like, they're using I said, colored. She said, yes, can I say it? Can I use this word? And she's like, I said, yes, and not only can you use the word, there are about more than 5 million people who still use the word and still see themselves as colored. And so it was an opportunity to go back into the past and explain why this word still exists and why there's such a, because what's great about stepping back is, I had to now explain where Aldo's is, right? Now, Eldorado Park is across the road from Soweto. It's actually now part of Soweto. So why is it that just across the road, there is a community that feels so separated from the black community across the road in Pimville? What is the division? Why is it there? And so it forced me to reckon with, because I'd also taken for granted, it's just the flats. Because Nathaniel Julius we lived at a council house across the flats. And again, these are just artifacts of our lives. But when you have to explain them to people from outside, you start thinking about it, right? And so the book has itself really been a journey for me. I didn't want to write it because I had a pretty ambivalent relationship with being colored myself. It's not that I didn't use the word. I just didn't, I didn't raise my fist in colored solidarity either, because also, if you're dark-skinned with Kruse in a colored community, it's not the easiest experience to have. And so I was not going to go and bat for, and I haven't gone to bat for colored people because I just felt that colored people had rejected me, so why would I have to? But it has been such an incredible journey of understanding what it means to be colored and what it means to be colored today.
What's the feedback in the colored community when you say I don't identify as that?
Well, I mean, it's not that I don't identify, it's just that it's not even so much feedback, it's my identification has been a response to people's questions. So, and anyone who's colored has probably gotten this question, right? What are you? Or somebody else thinks they're slick. Your mother's what and your father's what? Huh? They're human. And in that, for example, my family's from KwaZulu-Natal, so you'll forgive my terrible Afrikaans when it does come out. And so what happens is, we also speak isiZulu, and so they're like, oh, but are you sure you're colored? Because I'm hearing isiZulu in between the Afrikaans. And we're like, yeah, we are, and so it's that sense of, it felt like I kept having to prove my coloredness. And so then I didn't feel like I was going to. But in the conversation,
you don't tick the boxes of colored.
I don't. And then when we had the conversation about it, it was like, now I'm realizing I actually just remind you of that black great-grandmother that you probably didn't want to acknowledge on the wall unit. So, yeah.
Tessa, one of the chapters in the book is called Social Orphans, Not White Enough, Not Black Enough. And I think that's the stigma that a lot of colored people today in 2024 are still grappling with. Where do we fit in?
Yeah, so that chapter I named that way because there's no way you can speak about colored identity today without the phrase not black enough, not white enough. And I think of that phrase as social orphanhood, as expressing a social orphanhood and saying to society, the thing we're trying to say is that we're not given a legitimate space in the society. But that the orphanhood actually goes back further than just the question about not black enough, not white enough. It's actually about the ways in which the system has treated my community. And so I tell the story in that chapter about my father, and the whole book is told in the stories of and experiences of different either colored people who call themselves colored or have a relationship to the term colored. Where my father's classification, so my father's 82 now, so he's one of those people who went into the classification office to be classified. But his classification experience was one that was deeply, deeply violent. Not physically so, but my father walks in as a 16-year-old boy. He's standing in front of this clerk, speaks Setswana. He's a dark-skinned boy. He's 16 years old. And he just presents himself as he is. And he is classified as native. And this is not a problem for him. It's not something he's shocked about. Or he just presented as he was and was classified. He then goes home, and the elders in the family tell him, oh, you've been classified wrong because we've decided as a family to classify colored. Now, that in itself is a problematic moment, right? Because it speaks about the ways in which the apartheid system and white supremacy and its oppressive systems over time have created these divisions amongst oppressed people. And where you're having to shift and shimmy to just get a little bit more privilege or a little bit more opportunity. And that need to have to now make a decision to opt into a category that's going to divide and rule, essentially. It's a tool of divide and rule. I think must have been a very, very difficult thing for many colored families to do. But then my father goes back to the classification office to reclassify. And when he gets there, of course, he doesn't present differently physically, but he presents speaking Afrikaans and with an English name and gets reclassified colored. But with that, he loses his name, Lisole, his Tswana name. And I never heard my father's name was Lisole until he was 79. So between 16 and 79, he loses his name. He loses identity. He never teaches us his language that he grew up with because he was scared the same fate would befall us. And so he loses major parts of himself. The Group Areas Act means that he gets arrested for working in his aunt's shop because she's got a shop in the native area, and then ends up exiled, in effect, from the family, coming to El Dorado Park, which is now a newly formed colored township, meeting people like him who are now displaced, separated from families in some instances, trying to figure out where it is they fit in, and trying to make community with people coming from these diverse backgrounds into this category that's been created, and then having to make a life out of that. And for me, I don't think I'd thought about the visceral nature of the social orphanhood in an identity that's needed to be made through violent dispossession, violent classification, and violent reclassification or putting people into a new space and asking them to now make do and make community. I don't think I thought about the consequences of that. And I understand our sense of orphanhood because we are not given a legitimate space then, and we are still now having to fight for being legitimate, even though we've made community out of such a bad history.
One of the things that I always grapple with in Afrikaans, it's called the term kleerling, and I always say that term was given to us by an apartheid government because we were not black, we were not white. And yet today, in 2024, there are colored people who perpetuate and say it's a kleerling. Why is that still going on today?
Well, I think, and Tessa always says this, and I'll throw this in a bit, but in the absence of an alternative term, what do you create, right? And so also then we look at the way South Africa has restructured itself, and I do want to say that, we've just celebrated 30 years of freedom, and I don't want to denigrate the gains we've made as a country. It has been massive, and it is a beautiful thing to see. But there are also such deeply embedded structures of apartheid. And the system is still so deeply ingrained in how we move through this country and how we are. And so we haven't been able to get rid of the categories because I think the country is still structured in that apartheid system, even if we have changed the top of it. And so I think one of the other things is that when people use the word kleerling, I know because my grandmother still uses it, because my family uses it, and I guess we didn't think much of it. But what it means for us is it's no longer that classification on the back of your ID that was 001 Cape Malay, 002 other colored, all of that, It no longer means that. What I think it means now is that here is a shared identity. Here is a shared sense of community. Here is a shared sense of being. That we as a group of people have been forced into a particular community. We have, in some cases, been forced to speak a particular language. And what we have done with that is that we have created a beautiful accent, a beautiful lilt. We have created food. We have created music. We have created theater, literature. And so what we've done is we've taken this thing that the apartheid government has foisted upon us, and we've turned it into a culture. And that's why we say it's classification turned into culture. It is an outcrop of that coding of that system, is to say that we are a community with a shared sense of identity and history.
And my next question is to both of you is, I'd like to know from you who or what is colored, because there's a chapter in the book called Trevor Noah is not colored.
Yeah, I'll take that one. We boldly say Trevor Noah is not colored. And I don't think Trevor would disagree. But it goes back to the question about using the word colored and what it means to use the word colored. So for my part, number one, this book is not about telling people you must use the word colored, right? There are many people, like my father, who've been so violently hurt by that word that they reject it, who, through the liberation struggle, and particularly the Black consciousness movement, have decided to not use that word to opt into Black solidarity, right? And are rejecting the apartheid system, colonialism and slavery, etc. So I'm not going to say to somebody who says, I'm not using that word, that you must use it. But in the same breath, I'm not going to say to Gabby, my niece, who uses that word in a completely different sense for herself, that she can't use the word given the meaning it has for her. For the generation that comes after me particularly, the word is not the one that Verwoerd gave them, it's the word that their mother gave them. Colored is what their community calls them. Colored is about how they show up. So we've been talking about the Tyler debacle around people saying Tyler, shouldn't call herself colored. When Tyler's saying she's colored, and she's expressed it in so many interesting ways.
Proudly colored, she called herself.
She's like, it's because it's the way I speak. It's the way I dress. It's what influences me musically. It's what I think of as good food. Those are the things that makes her colored, not Verwoerd's apartheid clerk. And there's a distinction to be made between those two experiences. Both are equally valid. And I think we must recognize that, right? And we do talk about the fact that a classification became culture, not a culture. So there's also not one way to be colored. So this idea that there's some sort of box that you can, or list that you can tick off, these are all the ways, you were asking us about Afrikaans, these are all the markers of, that's not what we're talking about here. We're not saying that there's one unitary, homogeneous thing. We're recognizing that there's a diverse way that people come into this community that was created and has been created over time. And it is the community that makes us colored, not the classification. So even people who reject the term, rightfully so, because of Black consciousness, kind of that call to solidarity, still live in the colored community. And so you are in that community, and by virtue of that, you're part of that community, no matter what we call it. And so for lack of another word, it's the colored community. And we can call it another thing, but that doesn't mean the community ceases to exist. My problem has been that we've got stuck on the classification. And so we just think about colored as the classification. And then I, as a person, as a colored person, become one-dimensional. I'm just the word colored as a classification, this invention of apartheid. That time, and Jamal Khan, who writes the foreword, said this really beautifully. He said, every racial term that has ever been used has been created by racism and by white oppression. That includes white. That includes the word Black. But what the Black consciousness movement did was it reappropriated the word Black. It took the word Black that was created as a racist trope and said, no, we're going to reclaim this word and we're going to empower it with the values of solidarity and a resistance against, and we're going to conscientize differently around the word. And so I identify as both Black and colored. Both Lynsey and I do. Because I think of Black not as a race, but as a political statement of pushing back against white supremacy. But I think about colored in the same way that somebody who says I'm Zulu and Black, I am colored and Black. Nobody's ever said to somebody who's Zulu and Black, you can't be both of those things. I can be both of those things because colored is my ethnicity and my culture and the way I grew up. Now, is Trevor Noah colored? I don't think that we share a similar culture. I just don't think Trevor, and that's not a bad thing for Trevor. It's good. I'm sure he has culture of his own. But colored is not race. It's not biology. And my father, going back to that clerk, and not having changed a thing about his biology, but being reclassified, proves it. That it is that the only reason why it is a cultural thing is because it's not about biology, race isn't about biology, and we don't have to be stuck at that very, very bland, one-dimensional view.
Lynsey, I want to give you an example, but I want you to add on to what Tessa has said, is that I was part of another colored conversation a couple of years back, and we're talking about the history of colored people. And somebody made the example that Siyakulisi's children would be first generation colored. And I'm still grappling with that. How do you see colored people? What is colored? And your thoughts if Trevor Noah is colored or not?
You know, I think we place such a burden on biracial children to be. A friend of mine has a story in which he says, you know, he's black and his wife is white, and their kid goes to creche, and the teacher plays the role of the apartheid clerk and says to this 5-year-old, "You are colored." And he comes back and he goes, "Mom, I'm colored." And she says, "No, you're Tswana." And he goes, "No, I'm colored." And he's throwing a complete tantrum. And he's like, "No." And you know, and so, and this is, you know, we laugh because it's like the 5-year-old throwing a tantrum. But what it really is that South Africans move through the country classifying each other all the time. We are constantly classifying. And so I feel for Siya Kolisi's children because their history is now being erased. Because we are trying to put them into a box, and if they do not tick that box, then they are not legitimately South African, because we still define being South African as which box are you ticking. On the idea that who gets to be colored. So I think the story of being colored is very much the story of South Africa and the making of South Africa as a national project, as a country that we see it now in its shape. And I suppose you could argue that it starts, you know, when the Dutch first arrive here. And they have an adversarial relationship with the indigenous people, the San and the Khoi. And so then they have to name them something. So if I am the white settler who feels entitled to this land, you are whatever I'm going to call you in order to subjugate you. And so then that process of subjugation starts. And then what you have is the Dutch slave trade, in which you have people coming from East Asia, people coming from Madagascar. Yeah, I should say not being brought. Thank you, Tessa. People who were forced to come here. And people who are coming from Ghana, people who are coming from Angola, people who are coming from Mozambique, because I think the other thing about the way in which we talk about slavery in South Africa, and particularly in the Cape, is, you know, because of there's a focus on being Malay, and that's important. It's deeply, deeply important. But it should not come at the expense of the people who were brought from the coast of Mozambique and the coast from what is today Ghana, Nigeria, Angola to South Africa. And so then those people now find themselves here at the Cape, and they're not allowed to speak their language. And, you know, they form a community. They form a community before the word itself comes into being. And so when Cecil John Rhodes is looking for people who he can exploit, people who would work on the diamond fields, you know, he looks at the formerly enslaved, he looks at the indigenous communities who have been displaced, and he says, we shall use them, the colors. So they are not native, because he sees them, because they don't have a shared sense of, because they're not African in the way that he sees them as African, they're easier to exploit because they don't have a culture. And that's just simply not true. And so that's the first time we see the word being used together. So what that tells you is that being colored is a sense of community, and you see it with the people who moved. What I learned during the book was, my family, I've always said we're from KwaZulu-Natal, and I've always just said, oh no, you know, we are the products of Zulu and German and Dutch, or, you know, Zulu and German and Afrikaans. Turns out how we got there was with the Great Trek. And so my family were taken as chattel slaves up to KwaZulu-Natal as part of the Great Trek. So when that pilgrimage, that so-called pilgrimage happened, not only did they take the ox wagons and the animals, they took people, and they kidnapped people along the way. Children were taken from the tribes along the way. Those children were then baptized, their names changed, their languages robbed of them, and so they get to a new part of the country, they get to the Transvaal, and what do they call themselves? They call themselves colored, because they have nowhere else to go. So it's a community of people who have been rejected, but who have come together and made something of it. And I think that for me is who gets to be colored.
Let's talk about language. And I think here in the Western Cape, Northern Cape especially, the relationship between colored and Afrikaans is a very strong one. And when you move further north in the country, you find that there are Afrikaans colored speaking people, but that English and other African languages are more dominant within that community as well. There's a chapter called Language and Finding My Mother Tongue. Do you want to talk about the relationship between language and the colored community?
I certainly do not, because I didn't write the chapter. So, Lynsey, do you want to talk about it?
She's throwing it at me. No, I've got no comments with it. Yeah, you know, I think, so Afrikaans, I remember the first time I had to explain what Afrikaans was to someone. They said to me it was baby Dutch. Yeah, I was so upset. I was like, it's like, how dare you reduce this language? This language that was, and so then we begin to talk about what exactly is Afrikaans, the language that we speak. And so, the idea that this was a creolized language, this was people who had come from everywhere, because the first people to speak Afrikaans, and it is by no mistake that the first written Afrikaans is in Arabic, is because the first people to speak Afrikaans were black and brown. It was them who had taken this language of the colonizer and turned it into something and brought their own words and introduced their own words. And that's what differentiates it from Dutch. And so what we also forget is that there was a purification project that happened in the early 20th century where the blackness of Afrikaans was erased, where we became, the idea of savor Afrikaans began to take hold. And a large part of that is, towards the end of slavery and the idea that, and the creation of a sort of a poor white class began to develop. And what we found is that poor whites and children who were being raised by black women, were being raised by what we now call colored women, their nannies, the children were beginning to sound like the black and brown women who were raising them. And they was like, no, we can't have this. We simply cannot have our children sound like the servants. And so then, and we also cannot have poor whites who were living right next door to colored communities sound like them. And so this purification project happens. And so the written Afrikaans is very much an erasure of the people who made Afrikaans. And so this is why yesterday when Emil Janssen got the orders because for his work in Afrikaans, it means so much. Because what it does is it says that there is a reclamation happening about the language Afrikaans itself. To say that, that we are beginning to see ourselves within the language again. But it's an ambivalent thing, right? Because, activism, particularly student activism around in the 1970s, students had galvanized against Afrikaans as a language. Like that was the thing that brought them out into the streets. But what we forget is that the apartheid government had experimented with Afrikaans first language instruction in colored schools first, because it was a homogenization project, but it was also a subjugation project. Because the Afrikaans they spoke completely erased who you were as a colored person. They said, this is Savor Afrikaans, this is how you will learn Afrikaans. And so you had activists then who were moving around, particularly in the rural Western Cape, saying to people where Afrikaans is still very much spoken, and says to people, we must galvanize, we must join the struggle. But how do you join the struggle in the language that you are protesting? And that's where the ambivalence of being colored comes in, right? Because what happens is, because of the apartheid system, we did have some privileges. And very little, right? You're all fighting for the crumbs, but the crumbs are there. We had slightly more crumbs. And so then the difficult part about being colored is you are fighting a struggle, but your struggle is not seen as the same. And you yourself, because so much of your identity is rooted in this idea of colonialism, enslavement, apartheid, how do you fight the system that almost made you?
Yeah, that you benefit from in a way.
Precisely.
I want to stick to the language issue, and a lot of the time when colored people say, but I'm English speaking, they say, oh, but you're a Sturfy colored then.
So somebody in Stellenbosch said to us, part of what the book does is it shows our fail onderrokke of the community. And I think that there's a lot of divisions within colored communities. And that's not just the homogeneity of the differences between growing up in Durban versus growing up in the Northern Cape versus, no. It's also class differences. And so I remember as a child being in an English school, and remember being in an English class, it's not an English school, so there's an English class and Afrikaans class in the same school. So being in an English class was a choice my parents made. I actually started in an Afrikaans class. And my parents switched me into an English class because, again, the system required a proximity to whiteness that they hoped that English would provide for me. So if I was white, having Afrikaans as a first language would probably have given me more proximity to power. Being brown, having Afrikaans as a colored person gives me less than having English if I speak good English. So my parents are making these social maths decisions about what gives me the best possible chance in a system that is actively trying to keep me back, right? Now, in the community, this becomes a point of, you don't kiss beter. right? Because we were trying to be better, because the system was demanding it. It's the same thing that we do with hair, right? You wanted straight hair because straight hair gave you a proximity to whiteness that gave you more opportunities if you were going to go into the workplace. We were forced to play these games of how to become better, and it became divisive to our community. Now it's like, gaan jy iemand trou met ligte oë of donker oë, straight hare of kroes. All of those things are about our internal mechanics to try and game the system, and I think it has done a lot of damage to our community.
Do you think that's still relevant today, though? I remember when I was growing up in the 80s, early 90s, that, you know, they were always referring to the white side of the family and not so much to the darker side. Is that still relevant or rife in colored communities today?
You know, I wonder, I think it is. And I think it plays, but it plays itself in terms of class. And it plays out in a different way. What I'm increasingly hearing is people saying, I'm mixed race rather than colored. But what that means is when you get to be mixed race is that you have a very clear nod to a white parent or white ancestor. So you get to say, you know, that then makes you mixed race. And so that then also removes you from a class of people who are still, you know, we were just talking earlier about how colored people are seen in the media. And we've got a long way to go. Because what you're doing is then, so if you're identifying as mixed race and you're kind of removing yourself from a class of people who are still seen as downtrodden, a class of people who are still reduced to a stereotype, a class of people who, you know, it's overalls and rollers and gangsterism.
No front teeth.
And no front teeth, precisely, right? And all of those things. And so I think, you know, I think it does still play a role. And I think that it's not as overt as it was during the apartheid system. Because during the apartheid system, you knew instantly when you walked into someone's house, there on the wall unit were all the aunties that looked white. And like, no, you know, my auntie's got green eyes. You know, her picture's the biggest one. You know, it's an issue, right? And it shows that we as a family have value. It shows that we as a family, you know, come from good stock.
We're not like them.
We're not like them, exactly. But what it also is it's internalized racism. I used to say that colored people are racist. And I now say that we suffer from internalized racism. We have internalized the idea that our blackness means that we are not good enough. And we have internalized the idea that in order to strive, we must be as close to white as possible.
If there's any questions in the audience, I'm going to give you an opportunity a bit later. Luke at the back will bring a microphone to you and you can make a statement or ask a question. But I want to ask something that I feel very strongly about when we talk about the colored community. It's this issue about hair in the colored. Why are colored people so obsessed with hair up until today?
So I was trying to hint to it earlier in terms of this kind of proximity to whiteness. Because remember, this category is created that way, right? It's created in this kind of, you need to show that you're more proximate to white so that you can have more privilege. So a cousin of mine, this week, I was reminded about her surname. Her surname is Oliphant. And somebody spelt it wrong with an F as opposed to a PH. And the person didn't understand why it was spelled with a PH if it's an Afrikaans word. And I had to go, you know what? It's a made-up word. And the reason why it's made up is because the surname used to be in Ndlovu. But when you came to the registration office, saying Oliphant rather than Ndlovu meant that you could be colored, because then that comes with a privilege. And so we must think about the fact that that was the apartheid project. It was a divide and rule on the basis of proximity to whiteness or blackness. And the hair is one of the things where you can, Lynsey always says, you can't change your skin color with as much ease as you can change your hair texture. And so it became one of those ways to manipulate yourself so that you could game the system. And again, it's not only been harmful for us within the community, it's created, I mean, we've seen across the world the ways in which hair is this signifier of value. And whether you're more beautiful or less beautiful, more valued or less valued. And I think we wanted to, I think, you know, Lynsey's chapter really signifies a lot of that.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, with hair, I think, so colorism is a deep pain within the colored community. And I think one of the ways in which the reason it exists is because it defined your destiny. If you were a little bit light with nice curtains for hair, then you were going to find, you were going to get a better job and you were going to get a better husband. And so my grandmother is you'll know it's true. You had better prospects. So my mother was a nurse here at Somerset West, and she came from KwaZulu-Natal, and she was brown, and her hair was krus. And she says you could see it even in the kind of cases that you were assigned. You could see it in the lighter-skinned nurses. Also didn't really work that hard. She says, well, this is my mother's perspective. She says because they were going to get lighter husbands, because they were going to get doctors and they were going to be interested in them. And so you as the darker were going to have to work very hard because your value to the community as a woman was far less because you were going to produce children that looked more closer to black. And so my grandmother's response, my mother's response that she then passed to us was, you must be as educated as you possibly can if you are going to be dark with kruse. Because what do you have to offer in a community that has so internalized colorism, where we joke about things like, oh, do you use yellow rollers versus do you use pink rollers? And in every colored family, there's someone with a nickname whose nickname is Bura, because he gets to be light. And then, the guy, I don't know about you, but in KZN, the darker cousin is Shaka, because, it's racist, internalized racism, right? Exactly. And so, we make jokes about these things, but what it is, we have internalized racism to such an extent, and that's why hair, it's the last frontier, because it is something that you can change, but it's also something that you can't hide.
Yeah. Another topic before we go to the audience that I want to chat to you guys is something that I'm passionate about and love is food, and there's a chapter called Huis Kos, and there's a relationship between the colored community and food.
Are you looking? Okay, cool. So the first thing we want to say is that we do have cook sisters up in Joburg.
And not the straw cookie thing.
Yeah, cook sisters, yeah. Cook sisters without the K. But because our accents are hard up there. So we say cook and we say rrr, it's a hard accent up in the Joburg and Pretoria. But food for me has become this symbolic thing of what you do when the world gives you the worst. And the cook sister or the kusista has really become this point of what's the word? It's a point of subversion and revolution for me, because I imagine how it came to be. Because there was a thing called the Dutch olie koeken. And I imagine that there must have been an enslaved woman who was told to make olie koeken, but probably missed home. And she mixed in she must have stolen spices. I'm just imagining this, right? Because we have no record. But I'm imagining that she stole some spices off the master's table, spices that tasted like home, cinnamon, nutmeg, coconut, and she rolled it in. And that's that subversion in the kitchen, that you have made me a slave, but I will remain who I am. I will bring home who I am in a cook sister or a kusista. That's the thing that feels so. I think of what she's passed on to us. And I think that, and I'm so deeply grateful for this anonymous woman. And I think of how the Gatsby came to be, and how the Gatsby was a sandwich because the Pandy family had been kicked out of their home. And they find themselves in this neighborhood and they've got to clean up and there's no time. And they throw together what they have and they create the Gatsby. And the Gatsby then becomes the story of urban colored identity and a story of how you survive after the Group Areas Act completely dispossesses you once again. So there's continuous dispossession. And what happens in the kitchen of colored homes is that we recreate our culture over and over. But I also want to say that there are very different ways of being colored, and I did not grow up with Poboti. And I had also never eaten Poboti until I got to the Cape, because we shouldn't flatten colored identity. That's why we say culture and not a culture, because there are so many different ways of being colored. And what it is you bring your history and you bring who you are and you put it on a plate.
Pickled fish and hot cross buns is our thing. Is a thing that we did, and we must actually own it. It's our thing. We did it.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? If you look, there's a couple of hands at the back. You might just stand up and maybe make your statement or ask your question.
Thank you. I must say that A little bit about myself. I'm Ghulam. I grew up in Durban. I was born outside South Africa in India, but I organized, cut my teeth politically in the Western Cape, organizing on the Cape Flats. So I worked in places like Lavender Hill, where I met my wife from Retreat. And there we organized essentially colored people to try and make them closer to the ANC. That was our objective, in a sense. Now, so that's the kind of background. And I have a few questions, or comments and a question. One is, I mean, I can understand that people of mixed race don't consider themselves to be colored. For example, Walter Sisulu would be an example of that, as is Trevor Noah that you mentioned. So in a sense, it's partly how you were brought about. But the first thing is, when did people see themselves as colored in South Africa? That's something I think is worth thinking about. Because remember that colored people, or those who are called colored, had a vote not based on their race. Their vote was based on property and education qualification, and for a long time, people had a vote here. That I thought that was something one need to think about. The second is that one of the first political parties that organized who you'd consider to be colored people called themselves African People's Organization. I see you referred to that, which I thought was also quite interesting. So the question is, at what point? Is it after 1948, when apartheid became an entrenched thing in South Africa, that you began to get people who saw themselves as colored? No, I accept what you say, that there are people in this country who consider themselves to be a colored. But I thought that would be worth thinking about or exploring. I thought I should just mention one thing. One of the persons we used to work with, Mr. Marx, who grew up in Steenberg, and he was very involved in the UDF. And he used to say that colored people would follow the UDF more if there are more white people in there. And if you look at colored people in the Western Cape, more of them vote for white parties. And the rest in the country also, I mean, National Party or the DA. And why is that? The third thing, and I'm like, now this is like more worrisome, now that you have things like the Patriotic Alliance and the issue of xenophobia. Now, xenophobia is something that is now directed at so-called foreigners in the country, but you had xenophobia quite easily directed at people in South Africa itself who are considered to be different. In Durban, you have already had what we refer to as the Indian riots, or the 49 riots, but they repeated themselves in '84 and again in 2021. So that's something one needs to be worried about. Now, I think while part of the book is refreshing, you wouldn't know it, but you all mention a person who Ruth and I shared a house with in your book, actually. But we'll talk about that afterwards. So, I mean, I think the book is refreshing, but it leaves the basis for a more thorough examination of our people who consider themselves to be colored, and what is their particular future? How must they be organized? And how must they see themselves? And I'll just give you one example. They said if Barack Obama took up Kenyan nationality, which he could, he would never become president of Kenya because he's a Luo and not a Kikuyu. No. So, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I just want to make a few comments. Firstly, I want to commend you on your bravery and your clarity of thought. I must confess, looking at this title, I think that deserves a round of applause. I have to confess, looking at the title on the program, I rolled my eyes and thought, nog 'n onderwerp oor breinmense. And I want to comment maybe on two things. The first thing is it possible, and I put this as a question, that because generationally you're removed from your father's initial trauma and you're suffering a different trauma, you have less baggage to deal with when you look at coloredness, because many of us are conflicted and traumatized by this conversation. And so I suspect that, I don't want to make assumptions on age here, but generationally, you don't have that proximity to the original trauma. The second point is we all had this rosy-eyed, starry-eyed belief running up to 1994, where our slogan was forward to a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic South Africa. And here we are talking about race identity. So I lay the blame at the foot of the ANC, 100%, and you don't have to comment on that. And the reason I lay the blame is the biggest injustice they did to us was that whole mission of trying to build a non-racial, inclusive, non-sexist, democratic society. And up until recently, I was a member of the ANC. What has happened by this government is, regrettably, it has formed ethnic mobilization. So you have the Patriotic Front mobilizing on ethnic basis and not on this wonderful vision we had. Somewhere, something happened. And I don't know if you have any comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
Thank you. I just want to, as the gentleman before did, congratulate you on the courage you showed in tackling this topic. I was not keen to come to this discussion. Somebody else got me tickets to get here because I resist this thing of being colored in the old traditional way. But you know, you gave me some new, or you mentioned some things that gave me new perspectives on this issue. Not that I find it acceptable, but because I mean, I'm old. I come from an era where we prefer to be called black, not in terms of your color, and this thing of black and brown black, pink black. I mean, this is a nonsense that has been created by the present government. So, I mean, they have done as much harm as the previous government in terms of making people feel comfortable with whom they are. So I am pleased that I came. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think another, you can just pass the mic to the front, please. Final, another question at the back.
Ja.
Okay.
Hallo, u my hoor? Ja. Nee, ek wil net graag wil weet, is daar enige... Nee, kom ek vra die laaste vraag eerst. Now, of late, we talk about since 94 up to where we are now, which is a 30-year period. Now, this is specifically a reference to your nieces that you referred to earlier. Is that 30-year period long enough to at least identify either way? If you can, you know, very much the same. If I can refer to your father, about 80 years by now, blah, 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 blah. I can recall when my grandmother, toe my ouma nog gelewer het, dan sy altyd geverwys, los die mense. En sy my specific reference na die politiek. Jy weet, as jy nou sê, ons gaat dan toe, as jy nee, los die mense. En die rede, dan toe ek haar eendag gevra, hoekom sê oomie altyd so? Dat sy net gesê, dat in die tyd van jou opa en jou grootopa, dit is nou die late 1800s, blablabla, is het 'n matter van vir hulle belangrik gewees at that point in time. Hulle het net twee dinge gedoen. Veral as ek maar nou kan sê onder die Muslim community, dat nommer 1, opa moet gesorg het dat net 'n dak oor die familie se kop kon sit. En die tweede was gewees, leer jou Allah ken. So, you know, other than that, in the late 18 and early 1900s, was van veel minder belang, purely because it was possibly of survival. So ek wil net ons met dit ook in ag neem, dat alhoewel ons moet verwys na kleurling en allemaal dit, en ek verskil nie met julle daarop nie, is het ook 'n matter van die toestand of die ere waarop jy groot geword het. En dan die laaste vraag is net wat ek wel graag wil weet, is daar 'n moontlikheid dat ons meer verwysing van of die minder goeie dinge wat die wit mense ook gedoen het? Jy weet, as ek try my om identity te sê, because of late ons kom in gesprekke, dan verwys ons of na, jy's colored, of jy's Malay, of jy's swart, maar dan, jy weet, asof, ja, die wit mense is daar, but I'm sure, jy weet, vir die by mekaar kom, moet jy dit 'n bietjie reference maak, ja. Dis maar al wat ek wil graag sê.
En nog net hiervoor en dan gaan ek vir die paneel vra om te antwoord asseblief. Okay, jy kan sê? Ja?
Kan julle my hoor? Ek gaan Afrikaans praat. Die belangrikste rede is, in 1918 in die Bo-Kaap was die heel eerste Afrikaanse skool. En vandag blyk dit dat my baie vriende onder die bruin mense, ek het baie, myne praat Afrikaans, my vriende, maar dan kom ons buite en dan is Engels die taal. En die eerste Afrikaanse skool in Suid-Afrika was in die Bo-Kaap in 1918. Ek self was bevoorreg om in 1973 die skoolhoof van 'n plaasskool met bruin plaaskinders te wees. Ek en daai kinders het baie lief vir mekaar geword en ons het nog kontak met sommige. En ons praat Afrikaans. En dan wil ek lees uit die boekie. Ek is seker julle almal het dit gelees, maar net om ons weer herinner daaraan. Die Suidoosterfees onderskryf en gee uitvoering aan wyle professor Jakes Gerwel, een van die stigterslede. Ons sit hier in Jakes Gerwel gespreksgroep, wat ons almal verniet sit, ons hoef nie te betaal nie, vir sy visie wat hy gehad het. Geleentheid waar alle mense welkom is, en sonder enige bedreiging of beletsel, hulle self kan wees. Dit was sy doel en ideaal. Daarom is hierdie fees oop, 'n veilige ruimte vir vrye en diverse artistieke uitdrukking, waar geen diskriminasie in watter vorm of gedaante ook al geduld word nie. So ek het hier baie dinge gesê om te sê, kom ons leef in vrede en ons is nie te bang om Afrikaans te praat nie. Dankie.
Well, dankie. Do you guys want to respond to some of the comments, and then I still have a few questions?
Sure. So I'll try and do a snapshot of a number of things. But maybe start with the political stuff. I think that, firstly, what do we do now with the apartheid classifications, with the apartheid system? Where have we gone wrong? And why are we still having this conversation right now? So people have asked me, don't you think it's time that we do away with the categories, those apartheid classification categories that we're still using right now? And maybe before I answer that question, I said to somebody this week, one of the things that always strikes me when I look at those classifications, that whether it's during the apartheid era or now, none of those classifications is black. So the classification is white, Indian, colored, native in the apartheid context, African now. The word black is not used. And part of the reason why that is because what it is, it's actually a division of blackness that those categories have created. And that's why I can confidently say colored communities are black, because we are part of a struggle against white supremacy. And I will get to the question even of what we do with whiteness versus white people and their efforts, because those are different for me. But when we talk about those categories, for me, we have no business taking those categories away until we've undone them. The apartheid government didn't do those categories arbitrarily. They created those categories with intention, with law, with all sorts of things that have created a society and have created its offsprings now in the democratic era. What we need to do is we must undo those categories and their meanings. What there's a push towards is a non-racialism that says the categories just no longer exist. And I don't think that's helpful when the effects of those categories continue to exist. And so I particularly think as a part of our political project, we ask ourselves, how do we start changing what those things mean or undoing them so they no longer need to exist? Because until we've done that, we will just do cosmetic work of saying, oh, we no longer use these words, yet we're still living those words and their consequences all the time. The other thing about it for me, Ghulam, is the question about politically, how do you organize colored communities? For me, this is not a project of colored nationalism. And I want to be very clear. This book was not written for colored nationalism purposes. This book was to give legitimacy to the fact that people exist, and they are here, and we are here as communities. But that is actually a call to solidarity with other people, not away from it. It's to say to colored communities, we are enough. And so we don't have to continue to do the oppression Olympics about who's more oppressed than whom. In fact, we must find ways of solidarity between oppressed people, as opposed to having to fight that we are more oppressed. And that's one of my problems with the conversation that we're having about the employment equity conversation at the moment, is that it's becoming oppression Olympics, as opposed to oppression solidarity. We must not use that moment as one to say, we want to show that we are more oppressed, or we must say, actually, the fact that we are still having a working class of people that are exploited, that are disenfranchised, that are having to fight for crumbs in the most unequal country in the world is the problem. And part of the problem is that the political elites and the political class have not undone apartheid in the ways that it's necessary. In some ways, we've just replaced the faces. And we must be able to say that when we see it, and say that the reason why we're still here is because we've not undone apartheid in its full and in totality. And that's also why I think the question about, when I talk about white supremacy and whiteness, we're talking about the system, not the individuals. So does a white person benefit from whiteness? Sure. But can a white person be part of the solution against it? Absolutely. So the system is the problem. And I think where we've gone very wrong in the country is that the oppressive systems are not being dismantled. We're just changing the players. And that's why when we now come into a point of how do we galvanize each other, we retreat back into ethnic, race, because we've not undone the process. We've not undone the system. Maybe one of the most obvious ways that we've not undone it is just spatial apartheid. So why does the Patriotic Alliance say that it's looking at colored communities? Because geographically, colored people are still living together. And their issues are going to be linked just because of their geography. And they're going to think they're different from people from Guguletu because they're not living in the same geographies. Our work is to dismantle oppressive systems, divisive systems, apartheid, white supremacy, and it must be all of our work, every single one of us. And it isn't a matter of just going back into our enclaves. That's not the way that we're going to do the work. Absolutely not.
Let's talk about the... We've got an election on the 29th of May, and I want to get your opinion around the so-called colored vote that everybody's vying for. And I have said it on public platforms that there's nothing special about the colored vote. It's diverse, just like the white vote. White people vote for various parties. Black people vote for various parties. But there's this perception that, colored people in the Western Cape vote for the DA. But then if you go to the Northern Cape, colored people vote for the ANC. If you go to Johannesburg for 10 years, colored people vote for the PA. It's a diverse vote. Why so much emphasis on the colored vote, if I may ask?
So I'm going to take part of this question, and then I'm going to throw a part of it to Lynsey towards the end. And Gulam, you did raise this. So my contention is there's no such thing as the colored vote, just like there isn't the colored community, right? Like everybody else in society, colored communities differ in how they make political choices. And so I think we're even when we talk about the white vote, the only vote we don't talk about in those terms is the black vote. That's because there are so many black people that we recognize that there's diversity. But with what we call minority groupings, which I also think is a misnomer, we talk in very simplistic terms, as if people just vote. They see somebody of their skin color and they go, yes, that is not how people are voting. If that was the case, Patricia de Lille would be Premier of the Western Cape. All right? She's not, because that's not the ways in which people are making political choices. So when I made the thing about geography, the easiest way to politically galvanize people is to show them that they have the same circumstances and the same interests. geography determines a lot of that. And so you get that, the ability to mobilize. And because we are still racially divided geographically in terms of where people find themselves, that's how you start getting these blocks that still look racialized because our geography is still racialized. Then you get the opportunistic politician that then uses race as a tool to do that. Then you start getting into a different kind of territory where people then try to bait you into saying, these divisions are real whether you live in this community or not. But it doesn't have to be that way. We should resist that, and we should recognize that our voting needs to start becoming about issues rather than identity. That issues sometimes overlap with identity, and this is why I want to throw this to Lynsey in terms of intersectionality. That's where it becomes really interesting. Because once we start looking at the issue, and load shedding is my favorite version of this, I keep saying one thing we must not do is miss the load shedding moment for reconciliation in South Africa. Because load shedding affects all of us regardless of race and reminds us that we have a common purpose and our destinies are tied. And we've created too many of these opportunities for people to opt out. So people are opting out of education and the education crisis by privatizing education, opting out of healthcare, opting out of this, opting out of that. We must not opt out of load shedding, comrades. We must go through load shedding together and we must defeat it together for the greater good of everyone. If we focused on our shared issues, we would find more commonalities than differences in the kind of South Africa we want to build. If we continue to only focus on the things that divide us, then we will continue to lose the opportunity to build. So I wanted you just to speak about intersectionality.
No, I think, so what I will talk about is, as a journalist, I will just say that I will not make comments about particular parties, because I have to work. You know? But what I will say, I can reflect on the work that I've done in the last couple months in preparation for the elections. And I've gone from, we were in a little town called Meermal, which is in the Free State. I was in Polokwane on Sunday. I've been in Durban, here in the Western Cape as well. And I talk to people, and my favorite thing to do is to ask people, who are you going to vote for? And nobody knows. You know, very few people have a definitive answer. And I think that is because we have a point at this point in South Africa right now where we are beginning to think about issues. And we are beginning to think, well, who is going to protect my freedom and who is going to help me build the future that I want? So in the last, you know, for the 27th of April, we did a story that asked the question, has South Africa truly defeated apartheid? And we tried to be as objective as possible, and we looked at statistics. And what we did was that we looked at the Freedom Charter, because the Freedom Charter informs our Bill of Rights and therefore informs our Constitution, and that is how we define freedom as South Africans. And we listed every section of the Freedom Charter and found that we had fallen short. Every section. There have been magnificent gains, particularly in education, for example, and houses have been built, but it has not been enough. And so I think the question that South Africans are grappling with now, 30 years on, is how do you truly defeat apartheid? Because I think in the euphoria of 1994, the world and we looked at this and said, you know, this is victory, we have finally won. And now we're beginning to grapple with the idea of just how difficult it is to dismantle a system that has been in place for 400 years. And how do you dismantle a system that, you know, even when you don't mean to, you reproduce them? Why are RDP houses still built on the outskirts of cities, for example? Why are they not built on the inside? Why are they not built in city centers closest to places of labor? Why is it that, you know, with our no-fee schools, 70% of the people who go to 70% of black children still go to no-fee schools, and no-fee schools are deeply under-resourced, whereas our former white schools, Model C schools, are able to charge private school rates and give a better education. We are reproducing inequality, and we are reproducing the inequality that apartheid created over and over. But what I find is a unifying voice is that everybody feels left behind. I speak to young colored people born well after 1994, and they say, well, we're left behind. There are no jobs for us. Nobody cares about us. And then I speak to somebody in Phoenix, Durban. We are left behind. Nobody cares about us. There are no jobs. Speak to a white dude. You know, he seems to have everything ahead of him, but he feels left behind. I speak to black children, particularly in rural areas, and they're like, who thinks of us as black people in rural areas? We are forgotten. We are left behind. There are no jobs. There is a unifying problem here, and there is something that we are all going through at this point. And so I think, you know, when we're coming to the vote, and we're coming to who you think about, I think what we should do is, it's a very dangerous place when we're not talking to each other, because we are all sitting with the same problem. And as a journalist, I'm privileged to go from community to community. People let me into their houses for reasons I will never understand, but they do. and we're not listening to each other. And the loudest voice in the room is an opportunistic politician rather than your neighbor. So speak to your colleague and ask them what they're going through. Speak to them. And this is where intersectionality comes into play. Because when we talk about, you know, Black consciousness gave us a political platform and a political foundation to say, you know, how will we dismantle the ideas of white supremacy, particularly mentally, because that's where the battle begins, right? But when you're moving through the world, you don't just move through the world as a Black person and as a political entity. You move through the world as a woman. You move through the world as a queer person. You move through the world as a mother. You move through the world as a person who chooses to be childless. You move through the world in so many different ways. And what intersectionality does is that it asks us to bring all these sections of who we are. Intersectionality as a theory was created by a Black feminist in the United States, because their question that they were dealing with in the 1980s was they were being forced to say, are you Black or are you a woman? The feminist movement didn't quite embrace them, and the Black movement didn't quite have all the answers for them either. So what did they do? They found a space, and they brought all their identities, and they put everything that they are on the table, and they said, this is who we are, and this is how we will present in the world, and these are our demands. And I think that if South Africans, rather than getting caught in the idea of, am I colored, am I this, am I that, show up as all of who you are. And once you show up as all of who you are, as you show up as an intersectional human being, then from there, I think we begin to find each other.
Final question from me, and then we're going to wrap up. The book is called Colored, How Classification Became Culture. Your wish for colored people in South Africa, going forward, the future, and also the culture associated with it.
Yeah, so my wish for colored people is that we reclaim our right to self-identify. One of the most beautiful moments of my life was when my father, at the age of 79, took us back to that village that was taken away, the land that was taken away, and the place where his name was taken away. And we went to go and find the land amidst just nothing in particular that we could identify. And he reclaimed his name for the first time, and he said, I am Lesole again. And I want that moment for every colored person. I want a moment where my nieces don't feel like somebody else must tell them who they are, where they can say, I am who I am, and they can give meaning to that in whatever way they want to, and whatever way is useful for them, without being told by somebody else, you can't be this or you can't be that. That is colonialism, apartheid, and slavery. Freedom must mean that I am free to identify myself, to build my own identity, to have agency, and that we have the grace to allow each other that. I know the word hurts you, but the word may not mean the same thing for someone else. Let's have the grace to hear each other. And if somebody says the word hurts them, don't force the word on them. Have grace to allow people to self-identify. That's part of what our freedom needs to give us.
Lynsey, your wish for the colored community in South Africa?
I think so much of who we are, and you see it even in political slogans, is not Black enough, not white enough. And what I would like for us to be is simply enough. I need not be this, I need not be the other. I am who I am, and I am enough. And it breaks my heart whenever I hear particularly young colored kids say, we don't belong here, we feel left behind. And what I would like for them to understand is that their very being is the story of this country, from its beginning into its future. They are part of South Africa, and that they have a place here, and that they are enough, and that they can build it.
Lynsey and Tessa, thank you very much.